Aristotle, like Plato, the accumulation of money as a treasure essentially considers as a potential money capital, and therefore, unlike Xenophon, also refers to this function of money negatively. Being ardent advocate of the natural, slave-owning economy, Aristotle did not understand the historical conditionality of the development of the exchange, and therefore could not understand the historical role of commercial and usurious capital. Aristotle attributed great trade and usury to rheumatics. Large trade, he asserted, firstly, is based not on the nature of things, since, according to the philosopher, money is intended only to facilitate exchange, but here they serve as an instrument of profit and thus fulfill an unnatural purpose. Secondly, large-scale trade involves mutual cheating. That is, it does not meet the requirements of subsistence economy to comprehensively satisfy human needs. Even more sharply, Aristotle spoke of usury. In money-lending operations, money, like in large-scale trade, does not serve the needs. However, trade deals with buying and selling, i.e. here the circulation of money ultimately involves agriculture, the creation of use values. In the movement of usurious capital, there is absolutely no connection between it and production. On the basis of this, Aristotle believed that in the case of money lending, money is in itself a source of enrichment, since interest is money from money. Therefore, the philosopher came to the conclusion that, from all branches of the acquisition, this is the most contradictory to nature. We see that Aristotle, when considering commercial and usurious capital, did not ask why there are commercial profits and interest. Being an adherent of subsistence farming and coming ethically to these categories, he simply condemns and rejects them. Aristotle did not distinguish economic categories from their material content and was far from understanding that money in the movement of commercial and usurious capital is an expression of production relations. Acquaintance with the economic views of Aristotle shows that this great thinker, comprehensively protecting slavery, found the deepest for his time understanding of the differences between the phenomena of subsistence economy and the phenomena generated by commodity money relations. Concluding the consideration of the economic views of ancient Greek philosophers, it should be emphasized that they, as ideologists of slaveholders, endeavored to preserve the slave-holding economy forever and assisted in the establishment of a military dictatorship. At the same time, fighting against the development of commodity money relations, they first paid attention to the production of goods, money, trade and usurious capital, i.e., phenomena common to the ancient world and capitalism and related to the political economy of capitalism. At the same time, we were able to make sure that, since the Greeks sometimes make occasional excursions to this area, they discover genius and originality. That is why, historically, their views form theoretical starting points of the political economy of the capitalist mode of production. Cf. Engels, Anti-Düring, pages 214–215. But along with this, it must be noted that the idea advocated by ancient philosophers about the division of society into classes as the law of nature and the identification of economic categories with things was first used by medieval authors to justify and perpetuate with the help of the religion of serfdom, and then from the ideologists of the bourgeoisie for perpetuating the economy of capitalism and wage slavery. In the III centuries BC, Greece was conquered by Rome, which turned into a huge state based on slave labor. The Roman state waged continuous wars. They contributed to the development of the economic and political crisis in the Roman Republic. Wars, commercial and usurious capital, as well as large landowners ravaged the broad masses of the peasant population. Because of the absence at that time of historical conditions for the development of simple commodity production in the commodity capitalist impoverished peasants, they did not turn into wage workers but into the lumpen proletariat. The military power of Rome weakened. In connection with this, the influx of labor slaves decreased, which in turn caused an increase in the exploitation of slave labor, which were not at all interested in the results of production. Owing to the intensification of the exploitation of slave labor and the ruin of the peasants, the class struggle between slaves and slaveholders, and also between the peasantry, on the one hand, the slaveholders and representatives of money capital, on the other, escalated. In Sicily, there were two major uprisings of slaves, in 138-132 and 104-101 BC, in Asia Minor in 133-130 years BC, flared uprising slaves under the leadership of Aristotle. An attempt to halt the development of the crisis was made by representatives of slave-owning democracy, the people's tribunes of the brothers Gracchi, Tiberius, 163-132 BC, and Guy, 153-121 BC, who put forward a draft agrarian reform. They demanded to limit the large land ownership to 1,000 acres, about 250 hectares, and at the expense of the state land fund they proposed the creation of a new peasantry from the lumped-on proletariat and strengthen the position of the ruined peasants. According to the draft reform of the impoverished, every citizen had to get 30 uger land, 712 ha, on the rights of a hereditary lease. Thus, the Gracchi did not infringe upon the slave system and were not opposed to private ownership of the means of production. The aim of their agrarian reform was to strengthen the slave system. However, fighting against the big landowners, nobility, the Gracchi were forced to take the path of a revolutionary struggle, in which they both perished. The intentions of the Gracchi were utopian. In planting small landed property they saw salvation from the ruin of peasant farms and a return to that state of the slave state as it was in the initial period of the Republic. Objectively, the reform proposed by the Gracchi was in the interests of the people and was historically progressive. It provided for the creation of a small but free economy at the expense of part of the slave lands, which ensured a higher productivity of labor than the large one based on slave labor, and under the existing conditions it should speed up the process decomposition of the slave system. In the year 100 BC, the party of slave-owning democracy came to power, which carried out a number of laws in the spirit of this reform. Over time, this led to an intensification of the process of concentration of land in the hands of large landowners and the development of a colonial, a transitional system to feudalism. The class struggle became more severe. The aggravation of the economic and political crisis was reflected in the economic and philosophical views of Roman authors. Columella, 1st century AD, writer and agronomist, highlights the low productivity of slaves who plow the land badly in remote fields, graze poor cattle and do not care for the land to yield a rich harvest. Therefore, he stands in defense of the colonel. Materialistic and atheistic philosophy develops. Its representatives are attacking the social vicas of their time. They do not yet reach recognition of the need to destroy slavery by force, but nevertheless sharply criticize the parasitism of the aristocracy and call for humane treatment of slaves. So, for example, Lucretius Car, 99 about 55 BC, one of the outstanding representatives of atheism and the materialistic philosophy of the ancient world, accuses the upper classes of the fact that there, due to insatiable greed for money, the blood of fellow citizen states are being saved. The most prominent representative of the philosophy of Stoicism, Seneca Lucius, 1st century AD, comes out with a moral protest against the oppression of the broad masses of the population. He considers all people equal in nature, calls slaves comrades, friends from the lower class. Seneca indignantly speaks of the senseless waste of property by the great slave owners who eat to spew, and belch to eat again. Lunch collected from around the world is not even worthy to digest. Thus, the age-old view of slave-holding as a just and eternal, natural system of social life began to crumble. At the same time, further strengthening the operation led to a new revolutionary action of slaves led by Spartacus, 74-71 GG. BC. which Lenin described as one of the most prominent heroes of one of the largest slave revolts. C6 Lenin, On the State, Works, Volume 29, EFF, 444. In connection with the uprisings of slaves, representatives of the Roman nobility achieved the fall of the Republic, 30 BC, and the establishment of the empire. However, the imperial power, exposing the population of the provinces to a devastating robbery with the help of the tax system, further strengthened the country's economic crisis. The productive forces tended to decline. Trade froze. Life faded in the cities. They were filled by the lumpen proletariat, who lived in Rome at the expense of society, demanding bread and spectacles from the state, and in the provinces had to perform hard work, competing with slaves. At the same time, the parasitism of the large slaveholders grew more and more, which sought to sink the bitterness of the loss of Rome's former power in the most vulgar sensual pleasure angles. The decline of the Roman slave society has brought to life in the middle of the 1st century a new religious ideology, Christianity, which reflected the desire of the population to find a way out of this situation. The earliest Christian writings include the Revelation of John 67-68, C.F. Engels, On the History of Early Christianity, K. Marx and F. Engels, SOCH, Volume XVI, Part 2, p. 416. By its ideological origins of Christianity was a plexus of 3 directions of idealist philosophy: the philosophy of Plato, the Neoplatonists and Stoics. Plato taught that things are images of ideas that originate from an abstract idea, God, not pairs, head. Alexandrian Jew Philon turned the Jewish God Yahweh into a Christian Godfather. Stoics considered the active beginning of God, and matter, passive start. At first Christianity was the ideology of slaves and all oppressed by the world empire, dissatisfied with the existing system. Therefore, Christianity superseded the national gods and became a world religion. Early Christianity reflected primarily the desperate situation of slaves who despaired of achieving their own liberation by their own forces and began to wait for deliverance from heaven, from God. Based on these fantastic dreams of slaves, early Christianity was spread the message that the Anointed One of God come down to earth and establish a millennial kingdom of universal happiness, where all will be equal to each other. In ancient Greek, the Anointed is Christ, therefore, Christ is not his own name. In Greek, 1,000 is chilias, therefore, the doctrine of the 1,000-year-old kingdom was called chiliastic. On this religious ground the ancient Christian communities emerged, which the state subjected to persecution, as they consisted of a smaller brotherhood. In response to the persecution, the communities were forced to unite, as a result of which a community of property began to emerge. In this regard, early Christianity began to preach consumer communism. It came forward with the denial of wealth, but recognized private ownership of the means of production. Early Christianity required the renunciation of the family, the household, and promised to destroy poverty by distributing consumption within the community. The traces of the community of property, which also occur at the initial stage of a new religion, are explained more by the cohesion of people being persecuted than by the real ideas of equality. F. Engels, Anti-Düring, p. 98. Already this, the initial stage of ancient Christianity, inspired the slaves, that they can get free only from God, and not at the expense of community funds. For this, let the glory of God will enslave yourself even more. The Epistle of Ignatius Polycarpus, cited by Aronovich, Essay on the History of the Early Christian Church, 1940, p. 75. Thus, from the very beginning Christianity did not aspire to destroy the class distinction. While retaining private ownership of the means of production, it preserved, and also justified slavery and played a reactionary role, as it distracted the masses from the revolutionary struggle. Therefore, Even in the initial period, Christian ideology was in the interests of the propertied classes. It should also be taken into account that in the Roman Empire the rich, like the indigent free, were just as disenfranchised towards the emperor as slaves to the slaveholders. That is why rich people began to join the communities. Thus the union of the church with the decomposing aristocracy was formed. In this regard, the Christian ideology began to change. The church replaced the doctrine of the millennial kingdom on earth with the idea of the equality of all before God, brotherhood in Christ, the doctrine of the coming of the kingdom of universal bliss in heaven, after death. She reconsidered her attitude toward wealth and, instead of a community of property, demanded charity, that is, transferring only surplus to the disposal of the community. The church sought to reconcile the poor with the rich and taught that the poor are rich in prayer, since it has great power before the Lord, and the rich give to the poor, and therefore the poor should in his prayer thank God for the rich who help him. Consequently, Christianity was openly defend the division of society into classes, and the only one found a pious wish for the exploited masses to their benefactor exploiters. C.K. Marx, Communism of the Newspaper, Rheinischer Beobachter, K. Marx and F. Engels, Religion, Gospelitas. 1955, p. 63. Christianity gradually turned into a great force, which had to be considered pagan emperors, and therefore at the beginning of the IV century it was recognized as the state religion. Subsequently, in connection with the development of feudal relations and the growth in the Christian community of property inequality, the church has turned into a huge mechanism for the exploitation of the working masses. It must be borne in mind, however, that the idea of equality contained in early Christianity itself was of a revolutionary democratic character and developed in medieval peasant plebeian heresy.